Story 1. I'll never forget the day the batteries almost killed me. It was supposed to be a regular day. I was out in the middle of nowhere, installing battery banks for two different customers. Just another part of my work, dealing with off-grid solar systems. The first job had gone smoothly. Got the system up, installed the iron Edison batteries, hooked up the solar panels, and wired the whole thing. They were these massive, heavy things that required a forklift to move. I'd done it 100 times before. Everything looked good. We'd barely finished the first job when the second customer's house was just down the road. My crew and I decided to grab lunch, talk about the job, get a little breather before tackling the next battery bank. Not even an hour after arriving at the second place, the first customer comes tearing up the driveway on his quad, kicking up dust like a storm. His face was white, eyes wide with panic. He was shouting before he even hit the ground. "You need to get back there now! The batteries! The whole shed! It's gone!" My stomach twisted. My heart started hammering. I thought maybe something had shorted, or maybe the batteries were fried somehow. But nothing could have prepared me for what he was saying next. "It blew up!" He was frantic, not even making sense. "The whole fucking shed, it's gone!" I don't even remember running back to the truck. I just remember hearing the roar of the engine, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. It felt like an eternity getting back to the first customer's house, but we were there in minutes. And when we pulled up, I couldn't believe what I saw. The shed was obliterated, just a pile of charred, twisted metal. The solar panels on the roof were shredded, hanging like jagged teeth. The inverters, the wiring, everything was in pieces. It was like a bomb had gone off. And the smell, God, the smell was worse than anything I've ever experienced. It was a mix of burning plastic, chemicals, and something metallic that made my stomach turn. We rushed out of the truck, adrenaline pumping through me. I knew I had to get in there, had to figure out what had happened, but I wasn't sure what I was walking into. The fire department was already there, dealing with the smoke. The hazmat team had arrived. But I couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. Something wasn't adding up. The customer was pacing, frantically telling anyone who would listen what had happened. But it wasn't the explosion itself that had me on edge. It was what he said next. They were just sitting there. I was in the house. I hadn't heard anything until he stopped himself, his face going pale. I heard this hissing sound. I went outside and the whole fucking thing just detonated, like a damn grenade. The fire chief gave him a look. I could see he was skeptical. He was probably thinking some electrical short, maybe a battery malfunction. But the more I looked at the wreckage, the more I started to feel like the battery bank wasn't just a victim here. Something was off. That's when I remembered the battery watering kit. Iron Edison had just sent us these new kits. They were designed to replace the old caps on the battery cells with a float valve and tubing system. The idea was to make it easier to top off the batteries with distilled water without opening them up. Sounds simple enough, right? But what no one told us was that this new system wasn't exactly thought through. We had installed it on the first customer's battery bank that morning, just before we left. I hadn't even considered the possibility that it could cause a problem. The kits were new. They just started shipping them out. We were the first to try them, and I had no reason to doubt that it would be anything less than straightforward. But now, looking at the destruction, I started to connect the dots. The batteries, these huge iron Edison units, were sealed tight. Normally, they vented gases through the top caps when they charged. But the new float valve system, it didn't leave room for the gas to escape properly. The float valve was designed to maintain the right water level in the cells, but it hadn't accounted for the pressure buildup. Once the batteries started charging and the solar panels kicked in, the gases had nowhere to go. The pressure kept building up until it was too much, and then it went off. As I stood there, the full horror of what had happened hit me. It wasn't just the batteries that had exploded. It was the whole damn setup. The inverters, the wiring, everything had been overloaded by the buildup. It was like a ticking time bomb, and I had unknowingly set it off. But here's the kicker. I had another one of those kits, installed on the second customer's battery bank. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I looked around at the hazmat team in the fire department. They were too busy dealing with the aftermath of the first explosion to notice me. I had no time. No time to warn them. No time to do anything but move. I had to get back to the second job. I had to tear that watering system off the second set of batteries before it was too late. I sprinted to the truck, adrenaline coursing through me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the keys. I didn't even tell my crew what was going on. Didn't stop to explain. I was in the truck and speeding back down the road before I even realized what I was doing. I could feel the weight of that kid in my gut. The sun was high in the sky now, and the day felt too quiet, too calm, like the calm before a storm. When I pulled up to the second customer's property, the whole world seemed to stop. The silence was deafening. I ran to the shed. My heart pounded in my chest as I got to the battery bank. I could hear the faintest hissing sound, just like the first customer had described. My throat was dry and sweat poured down my face. I don't know why I hesitated. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was that damn sinking feeling that something worse was coming. But I knew if I didn't rip that kid off the batteries now, I would be the one watching this explosion tear apart another building, another life. I didn't even think. I just grabbed the tubing, yanked the float valve out of the top, and threw the whole damn thing away. The hissing stopped almost immediately, and I swear to God I could feel the tension in the air break. It wasn't until hours later, when everything had settled, that I realized how close I had come. If I hadn't acted when I did, the second set of batteries would have gone the same way as the first, and there wouldn't have been anyone around to stop it. I don't know what happened to Iron Edison after that. I never heard about those battery watering kits again, but I still think about that day. Every time I'm out on a job, I remember the sound of that hissing, and I wonder how much longer I would have had before that second explosion would have happened. I'm just lucky I made it out alive. Story 2, it was late in the afternoon when I got the call. I had worked in this industry long enough to know when something serious went down, and this job had big trouble written all over it. I was with a company that prided itself on solving problems that no one else could. They hired us for the hard jobs, the ones no one else could touch, or the ones no one wanted to. The job was simple enough in theory. A contractor had screwed up big time, somehow blew up a double-ended medium voltage substation. I never got the full details, but from what I heard, they weren't even allowed back on the property after that. My company was called in to clean up their mess. When I arrived at the site, the first thing that hit me was the silence. It was strange, almost unnatural, the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I didn't like it. The place was isolated, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees. You couldn't see much from the outside, but the security gate had been smashed in, and I knew the moment I drove up that something wasn't right. I met the foreman, a guy named Frank. He was pacing back and forth, looking anxious. "Glad you're here," he said without much enthusiasm. "I'll show you what we've got." The contractor, well, they left in a hurry. They didn't even bother to clear their stuff out. We walked through a chain-link fence and into the substation area. The first thing I noticed was the smell, something metallic, burnt and sharp. Not like anything I'd encountered before. I could feel the weight of it in the air, like something was pressing down on me. We approached the building, and I could immediately see the damage. It was bad, really bad. The outer walls had been scorched black, and the metal doors were just gone. It looked like something had torn through them, not just melted, but outright vaporized. The concrete was a charred mess, with patches of burnt earth around the edges. And then there was that outline, on one of the walls inside, faintly visible against the blackened surface, like the shape of a person. I froze for a second, trying to make sense of it. Frank noticed my hesitation. "Yeah, that's been there since the explosion. Never could explain it. A couple of the guys who were here earlier said they saw shadows moving in the smoke after it happened, like something was following them. But I think they were just rattled." He chuckled, but it didn't feel convincing. I didn't buy it. My gut told me that something wasn't right. Frank led me inside, and the first thing I noticed was the melted light fixtures. It was like the whole room had been hit by some kind of heat blast, but there was nothing left to show what caused it. Just walls of scorched concrete and twisted metal. The air inside was thick and oppressive, clinging to my skin. Every step I took seemed to echo in the silence, almost as if the place itself was listening. Frank pointed to the far side of the room where the power distribution equipment had once been. It was gone. Nothing but mangled metal and burnt wires now. Looks like they didn't just blow the system, Frank muttered, his voice growing quieter. They set something off. Something bad. We spent the next few hours going through the remains, taking inventory of what needed to be replaced, what could be salvaged, and what should have been left to rot. But the whole time, that feeling didn't go away. The feeling that we weren't alone. The outline on the wall, the thing that looked like a body, kept drawing my eyes back. It was like a sickening illusion, almost like the wall itself had tried to absorb the shape, but only halfway succeeded. You could see the details clearly, the curve of a shoulder, the bend of an arm, even what looked like a head, but the rest of it was blackened and disfigured, a strange, negative image against the wall. I kept hearing faint sounds too. At first I chalked it up to my own nerves, the occasional creak of the building, the sound of Frank moving around. But as the hours wore on, I started hearing other things. Footsteps, maybe? Just out of sight, but close enough that I could feel the air shift with each movement. And every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. It wasn't until later, as the sun began to set, that things really started to go south. Frank and I were standing near the doorway when I heard a soft voice. Quiet, almost like a whisper, but unmistakably there. "Help me!" I spun around, expecting to see one of the crew members. But there was no one, just the empty, blackened shell of the substation. Frank was looking at me, confused. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice low. "Hear what?" He shrugged, clearly not getting it. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "I swear I heard someone begging for help. Man, you've been working too long. Let's get this done and get out of here before it gets dark." I didn't argue. I didn't want to be there longer than I had to, either. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. As we gathered our tools, I glanced back at the outline on the wall one last time. That's when I saw it. Faint, but unmistakable. A shift in the outline. It was like the shape was starting to form, to move, as if it was coming to life. A sudden blast of cold air swept through the room, even though there were no open windows or doors. Frank stiffened beside me. "Let's go. Now." We didn't finish our work that night. We left the site under the cover of darkness, and neither of us said a word the whole drive back. When I called the office the next day, I was told to report back to the site and finish the remediation work, but I couldn't bring myself to go back. I told them I'd be on other jobs for a while. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that substation. The body-shaped outline was still there, according to the reports that came in after, and no one ever went back to finish the job. It's been years now, but I still hear that voice sometimes, faint, like a whisper in the wind. "Help me." I'll never know what really happened that day, but I know one thing for sure. Some things are better left unexplained. Story 3. I live in a house on the edge of a quiet town, out in the middle of nowhere. It's the kind of place where silence hangs thick in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the wind howling through the trees. My wife and I bought it cheap, mostly because it was older than dirt and needed a lot of work. But the price was right, and after a few months of settling in, I started getting the repairs. The crawl space under the house? That was my project one summer. The crawl space was damp and smelled of earth and decay, with a few scattered piles of insulation and forgotten debris. The kind of place where you wouldn't want to go unless you had to. I'd been down there a dozen times to check on the pipes, the wiring, you name it. But that afternoon, I was under the house for a different reason. I was lying flat on my back, stapling down some homers to the floor joists, when I heard something. Soft, a shuffle, like the rustling of fabric or the movement of something small but heavy. It wasn't normal. I froze. My heart sped up, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. There was nothing that should have been down there with me. Not unless it was a rat or a stray cat, both of which I'd occasionally seen around the yard. I told myself it was just one of those things, something harmless. It wasn't. I should have known right then, but I brushed it off. The world had other plans. I shifted on my back, stretched my arm out to the next spot where I needed to staple, when I heard it again, this time closer. There was no mistaking it now. Something was moving under there with me. I pulled myself up a little and tried to peer through the dim light, my breath shallow. I couldn't see much, just the outlines of the beams and insulation hanging like cobwebs above me. The air was thick, and I could taste the dust. But I could feel it now. That presence. It wasn't a rat. This was something else. Something much larger. A soft growl pierced the silence and my skin went cold. I froze, too scared to move or even breathe. The growl was low, almost a rasp, like an animal warning me, telling me to stay away. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My hands were clammy against the wood, but I still held on to the staple gun, even though my fingers felt like they'd been dipped in ice. That growl, it wasn't a cat. It was something darker, something that shouldn't be in a crawl space. My eyes darted around, trying to make out any shapes in the blackness. Suddenly, the sound of something scuttling across the dirt floor made my blood run cold. A quick skittering, followed by a sharp hiss, like a warning. I didn't dare move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but I couldn't make a sound. I thought of backing out, of getting out of there, but the thought of crawling back through that narrow, dark tunnel while something was right behind me, that was worse than whatever was in the dark with me. I shifted again, slowly, careful not to make a sound. That's when I saw it. In the far corner, barely visible in the dim light, two glowing eyes stared back at me from the shadows. I could make out the silhouette of a creature, its body low and hunched, its shape disturbingly twisted, like it was crouching in a way no animal should. And then it moved, slow, deliberate, like it knew exactly where I was, and it didn't care that I knew it was there. Its eyes never left mine, a pair of dark, empty pits, reflecting the small light I had in the crawl space. It was a possum, but not the kind you'd expect. This one was huge, too large, its body stretched in an unnatural way, its legs too long, its snout too pointed. And that smell, the pungent, sour odor of wet fur and rot, it hit me like a slap to the face. Before I could react, it hissed again, loud and vicious, its teeth flashing like knives. The sound reverberated off the walls, echoing in my skull. I swear I could feel the vibrations in my bones. My breath caught in my chest and I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to run, to crawl out of that space as fast as I could. But my body wouldn't move. I couldn't look away from those eyes. It was like I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The creature began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, its claws scraping along the dirt with an unnerving, rhythmic tapping. Each step it took felt like the beat of a drum, drawing closer, drawing me into its trap. I was shaking now. I could feel it, my body trembling so hard I thought my ribs would break. I tried to grab my phone, but it slipped from my hand and landed somewhere in the dirt. The creature was too close now, its face inches from mine, and I could see the wrinkled skin stretched tight across its skull. It opened its mouth again, exposing rows of yellow, jagged teeth, and I heard another growl, closer this time, a sound that rattled my bones. I finally moved. Not a big move, just a shift of my leg, a shift that somehow startled the beast. It hissed and bared its teeth again, but this time, it backed away. A moment of hesitation, and in that moment of weakness, I shoved myself backward, crawling blindly through the narrow tunnel toward the entrance, my heart pounding so hard in my chest I thought I would die right there. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally emerged from the crawl space, gasping for air, my whole body was shaking uncontrollably. I slammed the hatch shut behind me, not caring if I broke the latch. I locked the door, and for a long time I just sat there, staring at the ground, trying to calm my breathing. I never went back into that crawl space, and I never will. Whatever it was, whatever I saw down there, it wasn't natural. Story 4. I don't believe in ghosts. I've spent my career working in places like this, old, decaying buildings that are more dangerous than they are supernatural. But even I can't shake what happened to me that day, down in those tunnels beneath that derelict asylum. What I experienced, I still can't explain. I work in maintenance, specifically fire alarm systems. Most of the buildings I look after are historic, some of them well over 100 years old. A lot of them are linked by a series of tunnels, especially around the old hospital complex. You've probably heard the type of stories people tell about places like that. Stories of ghost sightings, strange noises, and things that just don't make sense. But if you've been doing what I've been doing for as long as I have, you've learned to ignore the rumors. Most of it's just radon or mold or a bad power connection messing with someone's head. I didn't come to work for ghost stories. This job, though, it felt different from the start. Not in the way you'd expect. There was no immediate chill in the air, no eerie silence. But the moment I walked into that complex old wings, it felt wrong. It wasn't just the smell of decay or the fact that I could hear the creaks of the building settling. It felt like something else was watching, like something was waiting for me. I tried to shake it off, but the longer I spent under that hospital, the more it stuck with me. And it wasn't just me. My coworker Greg came along that day, and I could tell something was off with him too. He kept looking over his shoulder, like he was expecting someone to sneak up behind him. We were supposed to be checking the fire alarms, but it quickly became clear that the blueprints for this place weren't accurate. Most of the sections had been repurposed or sealed off decades ago, but the tunnels beneath the buildings were still active. They connected everything: admin, hospital, and the mental health complex. Some of them were even used for deliveries and utilities, but most of them were forgotten, locked up tight and long abandoned. I was working alone in the basement level, tracing wires through the crumbling concrete corridors. It was one of those days when everything feels too quiet, the kind where every footstep echoes a little too loudly in the stillness. I just passed through an old boiler room when I came to a door I hadn't noticed before. It was a thick steel door, rusted at the edges, but it wasn't locked. The sign on the door read, "Beauty Parlor." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up when I saw it. The beauty parlor? In a mental hospital? I could already hear Greg's voice in my head, mocking me. "You're not scared of ghosts, right?" Yeah, I wasn't. But something about this place felt off. I had to go in. The door creaked open. Inside was darker than I expected. My flashlight barely pierced the thick gloom. And the smell, it was something I couldn't place. Musty like wet stone, with a faint scent of something metallic. I scanned the room with my flashlight and froze. There in the corner was a narrow hallway leading to what looked like another room, but there was a massive cinder block wall blocking it off. That wasn't normal. Every other sealed-off room had a steel door or was completely boarded up, but this was different. I moved closer, curiosity getting the better of me. That's when I saw it. Across the ground, running from one corner of the room to the other, was a thick line of salt, about an inch deep, carefully poured into a perfect, straight line. The kind of thing you only see in horror movies or hear about in superstitions. It wasn't just spilled. This was deliberate. Whoever had done this had meant for it to stay. I felt a chill run down my spine, a cold prickling along my skin. I had a bad feeling in my gut, but I wasn't about to turn back. I pulled out my phone to snap a couple pictures, mostly because I figured I'd get a good laugh out of it later, show Greg how ridiculous this place was. I moved around taking a few more shots, then froze again. Something in the corner of the room shifted. The shadow, no, the shape by the far wall moved. I thought it was my eyes playing tricks, but then I saw it again. This time it was unmistakable. Something tall, something wrong, standing still and barely visible in the corner, just out of the light. "Greg?" I called, my voice tight, but there was no answer. I checked my phone, trying to hide the fact that my hands were shaking. He'd stepped out a few minutes ago, said he was going to check on something. I was alone. I don't know what made me do it, but I took a step forward. My boots scraped the floor, too loud. The thing moved again, the shape now closer, impossibly fast. My heart started racing. I should have left right then, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I wanted to know what the hell that thing was, what it had been. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, like a breath being drawn just behind me. "Leave." It wasn't Greg. It wasn't anyone. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the shadows, but the corner was empty again. I was on edge now, fully alert. My skin crawled and the hair on my arm stood up. I moved closer to the salt line, but I couldn't bring myself to step over it. It felt wrong. I backed away from the wall slowly, my mind racing. As I turned to leave, I noticed something even stranger. The door to the beauty parlor, my only way out, had shut. I hadn't closed it, but there it was, a thick slab of rusted metal now pressing against the frame, locking me in. I swear I could hear the faintest sound of footsteps. Someone was moving behind me. I whipped around. Nothing. I had no idea what to think, but it was clear that something wasn't right. I could feel it. I was not alone. Panic set in. I started banging on the door. "Greg!" I shouted, but my voice cracked. It felt like someone was choking me, like I couldn't breathe. I couldn't explain it, but I needed to get out. And then, just like that, the door creaked open again. It was Greg, his face pale, eyes wide. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he hissed, his voice shaking. "We need to go. Now." Story 5. I'll never forget the night the ground gave up its secrets. It was a few years ago when I was working as a foreman on a new office building project in the heart of the city. The area had been nothing but vacant lots and construction sites for as long as I could remember. We were setting up for a big dig, laying down the primary feeder for the transformer that would power the whole building. I had a solid crew, seasoned guys who'd been working construction long enough to know the drill. The day started like any other, bright and hot. But something felt off. Not in a way I could put my finger on, just a sense that the land we were about to dig into had seen things. I didn't think too much of it, though. It's just the way your mind wanders when you're working long hours. But I'll tell you right now, I've learned over the years to listen to those gut feelings. That afternoon, we hit something hard, really hard, around 5 feet down. At first, we thought it was just a big rock or maybe some old concrete, but when we dug a little deeper, the shape of it didn't seem quite right. I'm standing there watching my guys when one of them calls me over. "Hey, boss, you might want to take a look at this." I walked over, wiped the sweat from my brow, and took a look. At first glance, it didn't hit me, but the more I looked, the clearer it became. What they dug up wasn't a rock, it was bone. I froze. I couldn't move. My heart started pounding, and I had this sickening feeling crawling up the back of my neck. Bones. Human bones. My first instinct was to yell at everyone to stop digging, but I didn't. Instead, I told the guys to pack up and wait while I made a call. I'd like to say I handled it cool, calm, and collected, but I didn't. I felt the air get thick, like it wasn't just the heat making everything feel heavy. My chest felt tight, and I kept my eyes on that hole. It wasn't just bones, it was a whole damn skeleton, just sitting there, perfectly intact. I called my supervisor, told him we had a situation. He didn't believe me at first. Who would? We're digging up human remains in a city where the last burial ground was long gone. But I made him understand. After that, everything moved fast, too fast. Within an hour, the police were there, the city's historical department, and a whole team of forensic specialists. They roped off the area, and I was told to keep my crew away. No one could touch anything until they'd done their job. I remember standing there feeling like I was in a damn nightmare. 3 months. That's how long the job was shut down. They had to go through every inch of dirt in that section, checking for more bodies. The worst part? The silence. No one spoke. It was like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something, though none of us knew what. Then the reports started coming in. The bones we found? They were old. Over a century old. Human remains, but no one could say how they'd gotten there, why they were there, or who they belonged to. The authorities tried to calm us down. Just a grave site, they said. Nothing more. But there was something about the whole thing that didn't sit right with me. Something was wrong. Something was off. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those bones hadn't been lying there for a century without reason. The land we were digging into had a dark history, sure, but something else was happening, something I couldn't explain. The days that followed were tense. My crew was on edge, and so was I. We couldn't help but wonder if there was something more we hadn't found. What if there were more bodies buried beneath the concrete and steel? What if something was waiting to come to the surface? Something more than just bones. I stayed at the site longer than anyone else. I had to oversee everything and make sure nothing was missed. One night, about a week after the whole excavation mess, I stayed behind to finish up some paperwork. The construction site was nearly empty by the time I was locking up. Only the sound of the wind through the metal beams and the faint hum of the city beyond filled the air. That's when I heard it, a whisper. At first I thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then it came again, clearer this time. A low, raspy voice like someone was speaking right next to me. It didn't make sense. I was alone. Everyone else had left for the day. "Get out!" I spun around, heart racing. My first instinct was to turn on my heels and run, but I didn't. I froze. I don't know what stopped me, but something about the air felt thick, like it was pressing against me. I looked at the ground where the bones had been unearthed, the very spot that still held the residue of that discovery. And then, for a brief moment, I saw it, a shadow long and thin, crossing over the hole. I rubbed my eyes, blinking hard, trying to convince myself it was just the lighting. But the shadow didn't go away. It lingered, stretched out across the ground like something was waiting there, watching. And then, the whisper came again. "Leave now." This time I didn't have to think. I bolted. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life and the headlights cutting through the night. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. Story 6. I was working in an old building downtown, one of those run-down places that looked like it hadn't seen a proper renovation in decades. The kind of place where you can feel the weight of the years pressing down on you as soon as you step inside. Dust settled like a thick layer on everything, and the air felt stale, almost heavy, like it had been holding on to something. A guy had bought it to fix it up, but honestly, I don't know why. The place had an odd energy to it, something you couldn't quite put your finger on, but it made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I was down in the basement one night, working on hooking up some breakers to run some lighting. The job wasn't anything complicated, just your usual high-voltage stuff. Normally, I would have called it a day, but we were under pressure to get it done, and I had done enough of these jobs to know the drill. This place had a bad vibe, though. The creaky floorboards above me, the strange, intermittent sounds of the building settling, it all just added to the weirdness. My partner, Jake, was up top running some of the lines while I worked on the panel. The basement had this old-school setup. Really dark corners, dim lights, and the kind of heavy industrial smell you get when something's been neglected for far too long. I got to work, turning off what I could, but for the breakers, I was forced to do it live. It wasn't my favorite way to work, but I'd done it a million times before without incident. I was focusing on the wires, trying to terminate them hot when I felt it. A subtle pressure on my back, like someone had brushed up against me. My first thought was Jake, but when I looked, he wasn't anywhere near me. He was standing across the room, at least 10 feet away, with his back to me, holding a broomstick like he was ready to shove me out of the panel if something went wrong. "Dude, stop messing around," I said, irritated. "This is hot." He turned around, looking confused. "What the hell are you talking about?" I said, "Stop fucking pushing me," I repeated, now seriously annoyed. I could still feel that pressure, like someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. Jake stared at me for a second, then replied, "I wasn't touching you. I'm over here, man. Don't be messing around." I turned back to my work, my heart rate picking up. I had this gnawing feeling at the back of my mind, like something wasn't right, but I chalked it up to the fatigue, the stale air, the weird building. I went back to terminating the wires, trying to ignore the lingering sensation of someone right behind me. But then it happened again. That pressure, a nudge, like someone was gently but insistently pushing against me. It was stronger this time, almost like a hand on my back, but I was still alone in the room. I spun around, heart in my throat, ready to tell Jake to cut it out, but he was still over by the far wall, not even close. I'm not gonna lie, my skin crawled. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was just the tension of working with live wires in a sketchy old building. But as I bent back down, I felt it again. This time, it wasn't just a brush. It was a shove, a hard push that sent me stumbling forward, my arms instinctively shooting out to catch myself on the panel. My heart slammed in my chest. I whipped around, ready to throw my hands up and yell at Jake. But he was still standing across the room, completely still. At this point, I knew something was off. My whole body was on high alert. That was no damn coincidence. Something was in the room with me. I turned back to my work, trying to focus, but my hands were trembling. My pulse was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was getting more aggressive. The next time I felt it, it wasn't a push. It was a full-on shove, like someone had slammed me from behind, forcing me right into the panel. I stumbled, almost lost my footing, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. This wasn't just me imagining things. I wasn't that tired or out of it. I knew what I'd felt. I turned around, ready to snap at Jake, but I froze. He was standing across the room, exactly where he had been the whole time. "Jake!" I called out, my voice shaky. "Get over here, now!" He looked confused but walked over. "What's going on, man?" "I need you behind me," I said. And I wasn't asking. There was no way I was going back to finishing that job with whatever the hell was in that room with me. Jake came up behind me, standing just a foot or so away. As soon as he was there, the pressure stopped. The air seemed to settle. I could still feel the tension in the room, but it wasn't the same. There were no more nudges, no more pushes. We finished up the job quickly after that, and I never looked back. I didn't even say goodbye to the guy who was buying the place. I didn't want anything to do with that building ever again. To this day, I don't know what happened in that basement, but whatever it was, I'm damn sure it wasn't just my imagination. There was something in that room, something that was trying to make sure I didn't finish that job. And I'm not stupid enough to think it was just the building settling. I'll never step foot in that place again, and I wouldn't recommend anyone else does either. Story 7. I'll never forget the day it happened. It still gives me chills just thinking about it. I was fresh into the electrical program, still trying to get my bearings with the jargon, wiring diagrams, and all the other technical stuff. Our instructor, Mr. Conway, was a seasoned pro. He had more hands-on experience than most of us could ever hope to gather in a lifetime. What set him apart from the rest wasn't just his knowledge, though. It was the way he told stories. He wasn't the type of guy to throw around wild tales to get attention either. When he spoke, people listened. He didn't embellish. It was all real, every word, every detail. Mr. Conway's stories were dark, not dark in the way you'd hear about in a spooky movie or a campfire ghost story, but in a way that felt too raw, too real, and too unexplainable to shake off. I remember one afternoon after class, we were all gathered in the back room of the workshop, cleaning up and wrapping up some of the day's work. I was grabbing my stuff when Mr. Conway, who'd been packing up his tools for a while, called me over. He motioned to one of the old chairs by the window and nodded for me to sit. He looked almost tired, like the weight of the world was on him, but he still had that same intense, steady gaze that commanded your attention. "You want to hear about the time I found something I wish I hadn't?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I didn't know what he was getting at, but I'd always been intrigued by his past, so I nodded. He hesitated, like he was pulling up something from deep inside, something that had stayed buried for a long time. Then he began. It started when they needed extra hands for the demolition of an old mental hospital. The place had been abandoned for years, and the city was finally tearing it down. The building was old. Stone walls, rusted gates, that kind of thing. It had a reputation, too. People said it was cursed, haunted, that sort of nonsense. But to Conway, it was just another job. He wasn't the type to let rumors or ghost stories slow him down. He told me he'd been assigned to help the crew with the electrical work, cutting power to certain sections of the building, disabling old wiring, and making sure things didn't spark up when they started hauling debris. He wasn't the type to get spooked by things, but he admitted that as soon as he walked in, he could feel it, a weird, heavy atmosphere that stuck to your skin. The place felt like it was alive, like there was something there waiting for them. The crew had been working there for a few days, tearing down walls, moving out old equipment, and taking down rusted pipes. One day, as they were dismantling some of the internal structures, Conway got sent to check on an old crawl space in the basement. It was cramped, filthy, and dark as hell. He'd crawled in with just a flashlight, barely enough space to move. The only sound was his breath and the occasional distant scrape of tools from the crew above. But when he got deeper into the crawl space, he felt a strange sensation, like the air was suddenly thicker, colder. His breath came out in a cloud of mist, though the temperature hadn't dropped that much. It was then he heard it, a soft, scuffling noise, almost like something dragging across the floor. At first, he thought it was just a rat or some other animal, maybe a raccoon. He'd seen plenty of that in places like this, rats in the walls and the pipes in the corners. It was just part of the job. But then the sound stopped. It went silent. Conway paused, the flashlight flickering. He called out, "Hey, is anyone down here?" No answer, just the echoes of his own voice, bouncing back from the dark corners. He crept forward a few more feet, his heart starting to pound in his chest. And that's when he saw it. At the far end of the crawl space, tucked in the shadows, there was something, someone. At first he thought it was a pile of clothes or debris, but when the flashlight hit it more directly, he realized that what he was looking at wasn't a pile of clothing at all. It was a body, a human body. But it wasn't just a body. It was wrong. The skin was pale, sickly white, the face gaunt with eyes that seemed to stare straight through him. The body lay in a twisted position, as if it had been shoved into the corner and forgotten. Conway didn't even think. He didn't approach it. He didn't touch it. The only thing he could do was crawl backward, slowly at first, not breaking eye contact with the thing in the corner. His heart was hammering in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears. It felt like everything inside him was screaming to leave, to get out. But he couldn't stop looking at the body. As he backed away, he reached the spot where the dirt floor gave way to the concrete foundation of the building. That's when he heard it, the faintest whisper, just beyond the threshold of hearing, but clear enough to make him freeze. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew one thing. It was alive, and whatever it was, it knew he was there. He didn't even wait to see if it moved. He crawled back, not caring about the dust or the rats or the cockroaches that crawled over him. His hands were shaking as he pulled himself out of that crawl space. The air seemed to press down on him harder, suffocating him, but he made it back to the entrance, his breath ragged and the flashlight in his hand trembling. When he got to the foreman, all he could manage was one sentence. "There's a body down there." And just like that, he walked out. He didn't wait for anyone to follow, didn't wait for anyone to check. He just left, took the rest of the day off. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Mr. Conway sat back in his chair, his eyes distant, the weight of the story settling over him. He didn't look scared anymore, just worn out, like something had been taken from him that day, and he'd never fully gotten it back. That was the last time I ever heard him talk about that job. He never went back to that building, never talked about it after that day. And as for me, I never looked at crawl spaces the same way again. I don't know what was down there, but whatever it was, I don't think it ever really left. Conway's voice still echoes in my head whenever I'm alone in the dark. Some things, they don't stay buried. Story 8. It was the kind of job I hated, the kind that had no business being done, but here I was. Me and Jack, another guy from the crew, stuck in a dusty old attic in the middle of nowhere. The farmhouse was more than 100 years old, creaky and stifling, smelling like old wood and mildew. The air was thick with heat and the kind of oppressive silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. We'd been up there for hours, scouring the insulation, checking the can lights, trying to figure out why the circuit kept cutting in and out. The lady who owned the place, some retired school teacher who'd lived alone in this rickety house for God knows how long, was as odd as the place itself. She didn't say much when we first arrived, just pointed to the attic and muttered something about a short before disappearing into the shadows. The only light we had were the little glow from our Nextel screens, the kind of phones that were practically bricks. No flashlight, no spare batteries. The moment we stepped up into that attic, I regretted it. The heat from the tin roof was unbearable, and the floorboards creaked under our weight like they were going to give out. But we had a job to do, so we started poking around in the crawl spaces and rafters. Every few feet, we'd find something odd. Snake skins, long, twisting, leathery things that looked like they could have been 6 feet long. Some of them were coiled up tight, still soft and pliable, while others had been left behind, dried and curling. The more we found, the more uneasy I got. Snakes in the attic? That was a little too much. But we didn't say anything at first. Maybe it wasn't that bad. After all, we weren't here to check for snakes. We were looking for a short in the wiring. But then it hit me. The air, heavy and stale, seemed to grow thicker with each passing minute. The silence was crushing. Jack wasn't talking much either. He was just kind of doing his thing, tapping away with his tester, while I ran my hand over the old dusty wires. It felt like we were the only two people in the world at that moment, isolated in a place so old, so silent, it almost didn't feel like it belonged to this world. We found no short, just snake skins, snake droppings, and a whole lot of nothing else. We started heading back toward the ladder, frustrated and ready to call it a day. But then I heard something. It was barely a sound, but it was there. A faint scraping noise, like something heavy sliding over wood. It came from beneath the floor, right where the attic met the old beams. I froze. Jack must have heard it too, because he stopped what he was doing and turned toward me. "You hear that?" I whispered, my throat dry. Jack didn't answer right away. He just nodded slowly. His face was pale, his eyes wide. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Jack wasn't scared of much. He'd been through enough in his time to know when something was off. But this was different. His hand shook slightly as he reached for his phone. "We should go," he said quietly, almost too quietly. I didn't argue. We both knew something was off. There was no explaining it, no reason to hang around longer than we needed to. We started moving toward the ladder, trying to act calm like everything was normal. But then I felt it, a subtle shift in the air, like a presence had entered the space. And I swear to God, I heard it again. A soft, slithering sound. Closer this time. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Jack nodded again, his eyes wide, and for a second I saw something in his expression that made the hair on my neck stand up. Fear. Real fear. "Let's get out of here," he said, and his voice cracked a little, like he was trying not to sound scared. We scrambled for the ladder, both of us tripping over the loose insulation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I could feel it, deep in my bones. The closer we got to the ladder, the more I felt like we were being followed. The scraping noise came again, louder, closer, like something was dragging itself across the floor. I glanced back, half expecting to see a giant snake sliding toward us. But there was nothing, just the darkness of the attic, empty and still. My heart was pounding in my chest as I finally made it to the ladder. Jack was right behind me, his breath shallow and fast. We didn't speak a word as we climbed down, the sounds of our feet echoing in the otherwise silent house. When we hit the main floor, we both let out a breath we hadn't realized we'd been holding. The old lady was still in the living room, sitting in a rocking chair by the window, staring out at the dying light. We told her we didn't find anything wrong with the wiring, just some snakeskins. Her expression didn't change, just a little smile as she tilted her head. "You should see the one in the crawl space," she said, like it was nothing. Like we hadn't just spent the last hour nearly crapping ourselves in that attic. "Big one," she added. "Maybe you can find out what's been messing with the lights." I don't know what came over me, but I couldn't get out of there fast enough. Jack and I didn't say a word on the drive back. We didn't have to. The air in that attic, the strange, slithering feeling, the scraping sounds, none of it made sense. But something in that house didn't belong, and I don't think it was just the snakes. I've never gone back to that house, and if anyone asks me about it, I just tell them it's not worth the trouble. There are things in this world that you don't try to explain, things that linger in places you don't want to be. Some things aren't meant to be understood. But I'll never forget the look on that lady's face when she mentioned the crawl space. That's a detail I'll never shake. Because whatever was up there in the attic, I'm pretty sure it wasn't the only thing living in that house. Story 9. I had been in the trade for years, pulling wire, crawling under trailers, feeding new lines to solar panels. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and the work was always there. This one job was no different. Or so I thought. It was an old trailer park, deep in the rural outskirts, miles from the nearest town. The place had seen better days, but it was still home to a handful of folks who didn't mind the isolation. The crawl spaces were tight, dark, and always filled with the smell of decay, but it was nothing new to me. The rattling sound of rats in the walls and the telltale scent of droppings were just part of the job. I pulled up to the site just as the sun was dipping behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the cracked asphalt and rusty mobile homes. The place looked empty, save for a few dim lights flickering in the distance. I got out of my truck, gathered my tools, and made my way to the meter pedestal. The task seemed simple enough. Crawl under the trailer, pull the new feeders through, and call it a day. But when I squatted down to crawl under the first trailer, I had a strange feeling in my gut. Like I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was something heavier, something cold, creeping up my spine. I shook it off as best I could and squeezed into the crawl space. The air was thick and musty, a mix of old dirt and stale humidity. The moisture barrier had just been replaced, a fresh sheet of plastic that crackled beneath my knees. It was a good sign, I thought. At least the rats hadn't chewed through it yet. I crawled deeper, the darkness pressing in on all sides. There was always a moment of discomfort in these spaces, a brief sense of vulnerability. But it was something you got used to. You just kept your head down and moved. No reason to overthink it. But then something caught my eye, a flash of white just ahead of me in the blackness. I froze. It was a rat, a dead one. It must have been there for a while, its body flattened, its fur matted and brittle. Without thinking, I reached out with my stick and batted it out of the way. It rolled and clattered into the corner, the sound echoing unnervingly through the confined space. I kept crawling, but that's when I started to notice it. The air. It was different now, heavier, thick with a smell so foul it made my stomach turn. I took in a deep breath, trying to push the nausea down, but it wasn't just the smell that was wrong. It was the atmosphere, charged, as if the very air itself was heavy with something I couldn't place. That's when I saw the plumes. At first I thought it was dust, a cloud disturbed by my movement, but it was too thick, too cloying. The plumes hung in the air, suspended like some kind of terrible fog, and it wasn't dust. It was tissue, a decomposing, rotten kind of tissue. I gagged and rubbed my eyes, blinking hard to clear the vision. It didn't help. The smell hit me again, putrid, sharp, the stench of decay that stuck to your throat. And it wasn't just the body of the rat. No, this was something far worse. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. The plumes twisted around me, swirling in the damp air. The smell was unbearable now, a stench that felt like it was in my very skin. I tried to push forward, but I couldn't escape it. It was everywhere, filling every breath I took. And then I felt it, the slick, sticky sensation against my stomach. It was warm, thick. I looked down in the darkness, but I already knew. I had crawled into something I didn't want to know. The evaporated urine syrup was everywhere. I was lying in it, the sticky fluid coating my clothes, my skin. My heart pounded and my mind screamed to stop, to turn back, but I couldn't. The plumes of tissue clouded my path, blocking my way. I tried to move forward, pushing through the damp mess, but my hands slipped on the wet surface. Every movement felt like wading through molasses. And that's when I heard it, a faint scratching, a skittering sound. I froze. I knew that sound. It was the sound of something moving in the dark, something small and quick, something that belonged in places like this. The walls, the ducts, they were full of them. Rats. But this was different. This wasn't the scurry of a rat. It was something heavier, something with more legs. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I turned my head slowly, my eyes straining in the dark. And there, in the corner of my eye, I saw them, black widows, dozens of them, crawling across the ductwork, hanging from the beams. I could see their shiny black bodies, their red hourglasses gleaming like terrible jewels. They didn't move in a hurry. They were patient, watching, waiting, their tiny, sharp legs clicking softly against the metal. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. And then the sound grew louder, a soft, wet squelch. Something was crawling through the mess with me. I forced my eyes away from the spiders, forcing my gaze down toward the direction of the noise. And that's when I saw it. A rat, or maybe it wasn't a rat at all. Its body was too big, too bloated. It was crawling through the mess, its fur slick and dark with something far worse than urine. I could feel my chest tightening, my throat closing, my brain screaming at me to get out. But I couldn't. I was stuck in this filthy, suffocating crawl space with spiders in decay and worse things crawling toward me. The air thickened. I could feel the plumes of decomposed tissue and fur swirling around me, smothering me. The smell was unbearable, and the sound of something skittering toward me grew louder. Something coming from the direction of the ducts. Something worse than a rat. The last thing I remember before I scrambled back, hands and knees slipping on the slimy mess, was the cold touch of something brushing against my back. And then, nothing. I don't remember how I made it out of there. I don't remember running back to the truck, but I do remember the sense of dread that never left me. Story 10. I've worked in the field for years, mostly dealing with routine calls, disconnecting power, setting up temporary solutions, the usual stuff. But this one call, it sticks with me. I don't know if I'll ever forget it. It started like any other. A firewater restoration company had called us in to shut down the power at an apartment complex, then set up temporary wiring. They explained that a fire had broken out on the third floor, and they needed the work done so they could start clearing out the damage. We've done this kind of thing 100 times, but something felt off this time. When I arrived, there was a scene. Police tape wrapped around the building like a second skin, and it wasn't just the usual cops walking around. There were detectives, uniforms, the whole deal. It didn't seem like they were there for the fire. They were there for something else. And then it hit me. The smell. Not just smoke from the fire, but something heavier. A kind of rot that you don't forget. I walked up to the entrance where a sheriff was standing guard, keeping people away from the building. He looked at me and then at my uniform, then gave a slight nod as if he knew exactly who I was and why I was there. I showed him my work order and he let me in, but his face was tense, like he knew something I didn't. As I stepped into the lobby, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The air was thick, almost oppressive. I could hear muffled voices up ahead, but the main area was silent except for the sound of my boots on the floor. The lobby lights flickered, and I caught a glimpse of something red on the walls just before the officer led me toward the stairs. I followed the sheriff, but the whole place felt wrong. We went past a hallway, and my eyes were drawn to the dark stains on the floor. I thought it was just the usual smoke damage, but it wasn't. It was blood. Dark, dried blood, pooled in places and streaked across the carpet as if someone had been dragged along the floor. "Upstairs," the sheriff muttered. I didn't ask questions. I knew better. We made our way up to the second floor, where I was supposed to work on the panels for the lower units. That's when it hit me. The landing was different. I had to stop myself from recoiling because there were more stains on the floor. Thicker pools of blood that hadn't been cleaned up. They glistened faintly under the dim light, making everything feel too vivid, too real. We reached the panel and I got to work, disconnecting the power, but my hands were shaking. It wasn't the usual nerves. It was something else. Something was very, very wrong. I could hear the murmurs from the third floor, distant voices talking in hushed tones. Too hushed. The sheriff stood at the bottom of the stairs watching me, but I could tell he wasn't watching the panels. His eyes were on the door to the third floor, like he was expecting something, or someone. And that's when it happened. A sound. At first it was faint, almost inaudible, like a whisper carried on the wind. But then it grew louder, sharper, a scream. It was high-pitched, desperate, filled with terror, and it wasn't from the fire. It was from the third floor. I froze, my body suddenly numb. The sheriff's hand shot out, grabbing my arm with an iron grip. His eyes were wide, his breath shallow. "Don't, don't go up there," he whispered, his voice tight, almost pleading. I didn't know what to say. The scream had faded, but the silence that followed was worse. It hung in the air like a fog, thick and suffocating. I tried to keep working, but I could feel the weight of that silence pressing down on me. There was someone up there, and they didn't belong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then came the voices. Not just one voice, but a chorus of whispers, all overlapping, too soft to make sense of, but still clear enough to send chills down your spine. They were coming from the stairs, from behind the door leading up to the third floor, but no one was supposed to be up there. The sheriff was staring at the door now, his face pale. "We've got to go," he said, but his voice had lost its authority. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my tools and we headed out. But as I walked past the bloodstains in the hallway, I caught something, a glimpse of movement, just out of the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it again. A figure standing in the doorway of the third-floor apartment. But it wasn't a person, not anymore. The shape was wrong, contorted, twisted in a way that didn't make sense, like something that had been ripped from the shadows. I couldn't make out any details. It was just a silhouette, but that didn't matter. The cold, gut-wrenching feeling of dread that crawled up my spine told me everything I needed to know. I turned away before I could see more. The sheriff was already moving, almost dragging me down the stairs, his face strained with a mix of fear and something else, something I couldn't place. We didn't speak as we exited the building, but when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw the door to the third floor, wide open, and I knew. That building? It wasn't just haunted by fire damage. There was something much darker waiting inside, something that would never leave.